Hello, everybody, and welcome to Police in America. This is our first substantive module, so to speak. Hopefully, you all didn't find it too difficult last week. We didn't do a whole lot of just introductions and reading the syllabus. But this week, we're going to start with our introductory module to kind of get you all introduced to the idea of police in America and the very beginning chapter. This chapter is very much an overview. It doesn't go in depth into a whole lot of things, but it just mentions a few of the things that we're going to talk about throughout the semester. So shouldn't be too difficult of a read for you. These are a few discussion questions, and usually when I teach this class face-to-face, we just start with these discussion questions and actually have everybody break up into groups and do it that way, but since we're online, we can't quite do that. But I would ask you all to kind of keep these ideas in mind, and I think you're going to see some of these questions actually going to be your discussion board questions and prompts that you'll see at various times throughout the semester. It's unfortunate that we can't really meet in person to talk about all of these things because usually we end up, these 5 questions gets us through the whole class, if not into the next class. But anyway, these are just some of the issues that we're going to touch on throughout the semester. And so I'll kind of go through some of the stuff that you're going to read and kind of give my additional 2 cents. And so one of the first things, and your textbook talks about this, and I want to bring this up too, is this idea that personal experiences vary. Your book talks about the idea of the inkblot test and how many people see different things when they look at the inkblot test versus, other people. It's all based upon your subjective reality, so to speak. And a lot of people see something different when they see a police officer. Particularly right now, people would see something different than would, for those of you that used to watch the Andy Griffith Show, you probably won't think of a police officer quite as Andy Griffith, and that's just a difference across time. But also it's important to remember these ideas of the ecological fallacies and overgeneralizations that you've probably learned about in research methods, which, means that just because, one police officer is bad, doesn't mean that they're all bad, right? Maybe one is corrupt doesn't mean that they're all corrupt. So please don't think that, just because one police officer knelt on the back of someone's neck, that all police officers are necessarily bad. I think it's indicative of a problem, yes. But that doesn't mean that each and every other police officer would kneel on someone's neck necessarily. So please don't try to generalize the behavior of one police officer to say that all police officers are bad, because it's logically it's not logical. And I like to use the idea and the example of a bad professor. All of you have probably had, at least some of you have probably had a professor throughout the years that you didn't like, and you thought he was a bad professor. Well, you wouldn't take that experience with that bad professor to say that all professors are bad, right? Because that would be overgeneralizing things. Hopefully you all, by the end of this class, don't think that I'm that bad professor. Anyway. One other thing that talks about is the idea that, negative information tends to be more memorable. And I see this, often in course evals when I go and read them to see what you all thought. Most people are happy to tell me about the things that they didn't like of the class, but I very rarely, I think it's probably because those of you that don't have anything negative to talk about don't fill them out, but very rarely do I hear, the positive things that students liked. And so I'm trying to record some of these videos to kind of help you all to get at least a similar experience that you would have if you were on campus, taking this face-to-face. And I usually teach this class face-to-face because I think that it's a lot more fun to interact with you all, and we usually have a pretty good time, and this is actually one of my favorite classes to teach. And please keep in mind that the media is often very biased, and I'd say that not coming from, the current Republican fake news dialogue, but I say this as, the news has always been biased. People have been saying that long before Donald Trump was elected to office. Um, and it shows that existing beliefs affect people's perceptions of the police. If you don't like the police, chances are if you interact with them, then you're not going to view that interaction as being very positive. Of course, the opposite is also true. Um, so these are some things to think about. Um, Policing in a free society. We often take the idea that we have a free society for granted, I think. We don't really think about the fact that, if you're living in Russia or Saudi Arabia or North Korea, you have a lot more restrictions on what you can do, on your freedom, right? And so, that was freedom that was given to us in the Bill of Rights, and we got a little bit more in the 1960s when the kind of the Civil Rights Act, and there was a lot of cases that were passed that kind of swung things back towards more towards due process. And then you had the Patriot Act in the early 2000s after the 9/11, which kind of made things go back towards more the crime control model. And one thing that you need to think about, and you might see this again later, is what is known as Packer's model of due process versus crime control. And he describes this model as kind of a pendulum that swings over time from crime control on one side to due process on the other. It never really stays in the middle. And ideally, we would have a good balance between due process of individual rights and controlling crime all the time, but it never seems to do that. It goes from one extreme to the other extreme over time. And we've been very much so in a kind of a crime control model throughout the 2000s up until recently, where I think we might be starting to see things shift back towards a little bit of due process, which is actually, I think, a good thing to see. Of course, some of you might have different opinions about that, and of course, if we were in class, we could talk about that. But anyway. So some of the controversies over the police, they're supposed to be preventing and solving crime, right? But this is actually more difficult to do than you might believe. There's so many other things that cause crime that the police don't have any control over. They don't have any control over whether someone gets fired for their job, or whether someone is a drug addict, or whether someone, is violent, or or a serial killer, whether they have psychological issues, things like that. They don't have any control over a lot of these things that we know are the things that cause people to commit crimes. Another thing is the idea that policing varies a lot across place. In some areas you'll have over-policing, in other areas you have under-policing. So it varies very much so across wherever you are. The police tactics that you see around campus in Kennesaw, very different than what you would see even in Marietta, for that matter. And you go to Atlanta versus, maybe you want to compare Atlanta to New York City or something like that. And then there's also the idea of police discretion. That even at the officer level, officers have some discretion regarding what they can do, and this is something that we have a whole nother module on that later on in the class that we'll talk about. And of course, the all popular use of force right now, which we're going to talk about later on in class. This is one of the biggest controversies currently in policing, right? And then there's all these other responsibilities, such as order maintenance, taking care of homelessness and mental health and drug abuse and things like that. And we'll talk about later on in the class how, the whole defund the police movement is really trying to defund take away some of the money from the police and take it to give it to other social organizations that can actually deal with homelessness, mental health, and drug abuse from more of a social problem aspect, or social health, public health aspect versus the police. And for those of you that don't know, the police haven't always been tasked with dealing with this. It was around the late 1970s to early 1980s that they kind of emptied out all of the mental health facilities and said, well, if you're not a danger to yourself or someone else, then you're out on the street. And the police get to deal with you, as well as homelessness and things like that, and drug abuse. And one might argue that the police are probably not the most equipped to know how to deal with these social issues. The police are, their main go-to thing is, well, either write a ticket or arrest somebody. But, and you can arrest people for being homeless, but that doesn't stop the fact that they're homeless. You can arrest them for possessing drugs, but that doesn't stop them from being addicted to drugs. And you can actually hold people for 48 hours for mental health evaluation too, but that doesn't stop them from having the mental health issue. And so part of these things are something that the police kind of get into with this cycle where they get frustrated that they arrest people the same thing over and over again. It's because arresting people doesn't always work. It doesn't stop them from being addicted to drugs or being homeless or having mental health issues just because we've arrested them. It's kind of like beating someone with a bat and being like, no, you stop having that cold, no more being sick. And, it doesn't matter how many times you hit them over the head, they're still going to be sick. They might try to hide the symptoms from you a little bit better, but they're still going to be sick, and that response is not really going to fix things. I've put this up here because I think this is always interesting to look at. Is the percentage of victimizations of crime that are reported to the police. And you see that motor vehicle theft is at the very top percentage of about 75%. And then you have your violent crimes of, pretty high too. Motor vehicle theft, and I like to, students often find this interesting, motor vehicle theft is predominantly reported most of the time because people have insurance, and their insurance requires a police report before they will do anything about it. So, that drives that up a little bit. Murders often get, reported as well. However, you can't really report a victimization of a murder because the victim is dead, so they're not represented in this table. So measuring good conduct is difficult, right? When we try to measure whether someone's a good police officer or a bad police officer, what happens a lot of times is they'll measure it by the number of arrests that an officer makes. Maybe the number of state troopers often get measured by the number of tickets that they write. Or their clearance rate if they're a detective, the number of, crimes that they solve versus the ones that go unsolved. And this is, I think, is something interesting to talk about too, that I wish you all were here with me, that this is really biased towards narcotics. Narcotics detectives are going to be able to make a ton of arrests, and they're going to have a really high clearance rate because most of the time the only way they find out about someone that is dealing drugs or, in possession of drugs is because they've caught them dealing the drugs or possessing the drugs. These don't really get reported from different areas, so the clearance rate is really low or really high, and their number of arrests is way higher. Compare that to someone that's a homicide detective. Homicide detectives, you're going to have very few arrests because hopefully in the city that you work, there's not that many homicides. And also, you're going to have a lower clearance rate because homicides are much harder to solve than catching someone with some drugs. And this tends to be why, some officers tend to gravitate towards that sort of stuff because they want to be successful. They want to get promoted. And, a lot of people call the drug offenses what's called the low-hanging fruit on the tree, right? You don't want to have to climb all the way up the tree to get an apple when you can get the low-hanging fruit that's right there and requires a little bit of work. Or not that much work, sorry. And another thing to measure them by is citizen complaints. How many times has this officer had complaints against him, right? You have to think about that. Is this officer getting complaint every time he arrests someone? If that's the case, then maybe we have a problem here. The number of citations, I already talked about that with state troopers and stuff. You often get judged by how many tickets you write. Media attention to the police, like I said, is quite often negative. And one of the reasons for that is, especially when it comes to use of force, is that, regardless of whether use of force is justified or not, it really never looks good on TV. Even if a person is shooting at a police officer with a gun, it doesn't look all that great when the officer shoots back at him and murders him and you see the video of this. It's still, wow, he just saw, someone get shot and killed. And the same thing with tasers and stuff like that, whether it's justified or not. it still doesn't really look all that good on TV, but it is very dramatic, and so the media likes to show it to you. Um, another thing I like to ask students about, and I want you all to think about it too, is what do you all think the crime rate is doing? Do you think the crime rate is going up or going down? And usually I get students to kind of debate with me about this, and we talk about it, and a lot of students will think it's going up, but then, a lot of the senior classmen and upper criminal justice majors have been through a class, probably already know the answer. But they actually find that the crime rate has been going down for quite some time, ever since probably the early 90s to mid 90s. It's been going down pretty consistently. So crime is not quite as high as people that are afraid of it really is. And of course, this is the violent and the property crime. If you looked at drug crime, which is really just measured by arrest, then you would see that that's gone up. But that's just because and this is another issue too, that crime tends to be just measured by arrest, because we have what is known as the dark figure of crime, right? Those crimes that go unreported or there's no arrest ever made, we don't know about. So it's kind of hard to measure that. I won't get too much into that. But the last thing I wanted to talk about with this little introductory lecture video was something called the Dirty Harry problem. And you all might be too young. If there's any non-traditional students in the class, you might have watched the movie Dirty Harry. It's an older movie. I think it came out in the 70s, and it's a Clint Eastwood movie. And you probably heard, the old, when he's holding the gun, like the picture I have there of "Do you feel lucky, punk?" You've probably heard that quote before. But anyway, there's an academic article that actually gets at what's called the Dirty Harry problem. And it's written by Carl Clockers in 1985. And don't worry, I'm not going to make you all read this article. I do make my graduate students read it, though. But if anybody's interested, let me know, and I'll send it to you. But essentially, the Dirty Harry problem is that the good ends justify the dirty means. So some officers might justify search and seizure of a car. So maybe they want to search a car without a warrant, and they do so because they want to find illegal drugs or illegal guns and stuff like that. That then they're getting this stuff off the streets. So then they say, well, it's justified because of the good ends. In the end, I'm getting drugs and guns off the street, and it doesn't matter how I do it. Even if I do it illegally, I'm still having a good outcome. I'm still, getting these guns and drugs off of the street. And so Dirty Harry and Clint Eastwood's character in the movie had a similar philosophy, only his was related to a kidnapped girl. And so the girl was kidnapped, and he wanted to find her, and so he took the suspect out and beat him up and did a bunch of stuff to him to get him to confess where the girl was. Of course, this is highly illegal. He violated his Miranda rights, and he pretty much extorted the confession out of him as to where the girl was by beating him up. And so what ended up happening was he found the girl, but I think she was already dead. But then what ended up happening was, because he'd obtained all the information illegally, they couldn't use it in the prosecution of the guy. So he didn't really even have the good ends that he had thought he was going to, even though he was more concerned with saving the girl than he was prosecuting the guy, the suspect. But anyway, so this is an interesting ethical conundrum that we'll probably talk about a little bit more when we get to ethics. But that was just kind of the end of what I wanted to talk with you all about today. And so we're right at about 20 minutes, so it's not too bad of a short little talk for you all. Keep in mind that this week and throughout the rest of the weeks, unless it's a test week, you're going to have a discussion board post that you'll need to do and a quiz on the readings. And so the quizzes, you get about 20 minutes and 20 questions, and then discussion boards, just make sure you get it done. Try not to wait until the last minute. I know some of you do this, but try not to wait until the very last minute to do it, so that way other people can reply to your post. And with that, I will sign off on you all, and please let me know if you have any questions or comments or anything. And if not, I will talk to you all next week.